Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to this setting. And I would agree with you that, all the recommendations from the project are extremely relevant for our work, as you could then see in my presentation later. Cold start, but hopefully we are on. Yes. Future climate adaptation strategy and what it is actually to live in an increasingly hostile climate. What is the policy take and what are the orientations? I mean, first of all, you know it, you are already rehearsed on these usual beginnings and framings of the climate policies, but indeed climate change is here to stay. We know that despite the economic activity slowing down in past months, the greenhouse gas emissions have again hit the highest levels possible. And so this is affecting every region, every person, every city in Europe differently, but it is affecting. And even if we dream about the best possible scenario of very aggressive reductions of emissions, starting now, these impacts are already baked in, as we say. Urban areas, cities are, of course, particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts. We are moving into a summer period where many cities will indeed experience combined heat waves with flash rains, for instance, or even landslides, as you may see on the slide. Since we cities also include a lot of green areas and often are surrounded by forests, impacts on forests are also here to stay, be it the forest fires or be it, for instance, the dieback of forest due to spread of diseases, for instance. So how do we situate it all in the policy context? Of course, the new climate adaptation strategy is guided by the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's one of the policies areas that actually does communicate very nicely across the huge spectrum of Sustainable Development Goals when it comes to poverty, water, oceans, equity. And you may have heard that on the 21st of April, so the day before the Earth Summit, Europe has seen the agreement on the first ever climate law that puts in writing the climate neutrality target and the increased ambition for 2030, but also enhanced provisions on adaptation, asking member states and Europe to measure also progress on climate resilience. Of course, as part of the Green Deal, we have the different strategies with which adaptation works very closely, like the forest strategy to come out, like the biodiversity strategy that was adopted, like the sustainable finance strategy that is due soon. First time we've got a vision with a sort of deadline to become a climate resilient continent, but this doesn't mean we wait until 2050, but all the activities need to be put in motion, had to be put in motion yesterday, today, and in coming days. And indeed, the vision is to be fully adapted to what is unavoidable, to what is out there. We have declined this vision in four main objectives, which is to become smarter, more systemic, and definitely faster. And of course, a novelty in the approach is to bring international partners and our neighborhood to this endeavor, as we shouldn't just look in Europe what happens, but that spillover effects of climate bring the reality always back home. On smarter, we have heard about improving knowledge and managing uncertainty. I'll explain more in detail. More systemic, we do operate now more in the economy or the finance world. And of course, it is about supporting policy development at all levels. Faster, we have solutions. Many of them we need to speed up the rollout. And of course, we need to help the others to adapt accordingly. First of all, smarter adaptation. And as we all know that the risks are here today and there will be in the future. And the sort of Hamlet type of question was, to what do we have to adapt? And here we really want to push towards more customized data, more customized knowledge about the cost and benefits of climate adaptation options, about the vulnerabilities, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, and how they match the different hazards. We need to use the digital advent and digital tools to actually experiment with it in safe place, so that we find the best pathways and the best options for adapting. At the same time, as you have heard, there are good examples of public-private partnerships where data are being shared, but there are others where we see white spots. And indeed, we need to move forward to sharing, collecting lost data for better decision-making. In Europe, the first to go on climate adaptation is the Climate Adapt website, where we want to federate other sources of information, and where you will find recently also the Health and Climate Observatory, again, a very important source for cities to look into. More systemic adaptation. All member states now have a plan. These plans are often not properly implemented or not backed up by sufficient budgetary means, and this has to change. A lot of these tools I mentioned previously on knowledge need to be also brought into these plans to make them dynamic and to adjust. We move also from the governance by purely member states towards more regions, cities, but even what we call the just resilience at individual level, which means looking at the different sectors that are exposed to outdoor conditions and that will be very much affected, typically fisheries, agriculture, or tourism. We need to integrate and convince also ministries of treasury about the need to channel money into climate action. And the best is actually to stress test the budgets and to work on the basis of climate scenarios and what does it mean for the public budget, because as we know, for a certain disaster or events that happened in the past 1 in 50 years and will happen 1 in 5 years, they will put a lot of strain on already stranded budgets. And as we go out of the economic crisis, we need to make sure that the post-disaster is led in symbiosis with recovery efforts, that we really build back better or build back bolder, as I've heard recently from the US. Often we are asked, if we don't know what to adapt with, what would be the first option to take? And their nature-based solutions are indeed the sort of no regret options. If you look at the triple dividend of adaptation or climate resilience, and first of all, you remove the risks, two, you allow for economic growth without risk. Very important, the third dividend is to benefit from all these co-benefits, social, cultural, or environmental. And this is where nature-based solutions shouldn't be just a reactive safeguard, but they should be deployed at much bigger scale than so far. Faster adaptation, I mentioned the nature-based solutions. For forests, we need to go, for instance, into looking into genetic resources for new forestry. I know there are many, Nordic countries represented in this setting, and this is really important for striving, green spaces of the future. Systemic and faster approach also requires looking at transport, energy systems in a more, and better fashion. We know now from studies that overlapping heat waves with blackouts are a recipe for disaster in the future. Can indeed, these secondary effects may come much stronger than the primary effect of a disaster. And so it is important to climate-proof ex ante these systems. Increasingly, we see that the blanket, the insurance blanket, or the risk transfer blanket of many people is just too small. There are only 30% of damages that are being, covered by insurance. And this is why we want to intensify the dialogue, not only with insurers, but also with users of risk transfer mechanisms, typically cities, real estate agents, and companies. And we need, of course, talking about climate adaptation without discussing availability, sustainability of fresh water, and how you can reduce the use of water, reuse in agriculture, how you can address the problems in cities, be it with too much water and deploy the sponge functions of city, or too little water by working much better on planning in the river basin are really the questions to crack. Stepping up international action, we see that a lot of slums, a lot of cities of the future represent increased risks for the population, and we are here to actually offer some lessons learned also from our European settings, but also to see how we could use the lessons happening in Bangladesh, in Africa, in our daily lives too. Of course, as there is a lack of climate adaptation action, sometimes it is very true that climate finance is still lacking, and we need to activate private sources here to build much better climate resilience. And this can be only done by providing better knowledge tools to investors, as was already mentioned, but also by exporting the taxonomy of sustainable activities that includes adaptation. And of course, partnerships, as was mentioned, are critical. Adaptation is a teamwork. It is a space for collaboration, and we can't do it, in our own silos. This is where you will need a lot of different skills, multidisciplinarity in approaches, and definitely bursting the bubbles that we still see in the society when discussing different policy approaches. We engage quite well with member states, and of course respecting the subsidiarity and the local nature of adaptation, but we increasingly also these narratives to shift and to say, look, there are cascading effects and of adaptation or non-adaptation from a member state to a member state, region to region. So indeed, our support will be centered to support to member states, subnational authorities, businesses, and even individuals, as we will use the power of the Climate Pact to reach to citizens. Financially, of course, there are substantive amounts of money now unleashed to support the recovery of our economies, and we should make sure that this money goes also to climate adaptation. And Europe is very well placed to bring together the forces of its members for better knowledge and tools. And in the coming months, we will roll out the so-called Mission on Adaptation, which is a research and policy approach to really make sure that the vulnerable regions get the knowledge and tools they need, and we can demonstrate on the ground that adaptation solutions indeed work. And of course, it is an invitation to work all together on this huge challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for this good overview. We have a quite modest audience here with not so many questions right now, but I would ask maybe from you myself then about maybe the next steps, what are planned.
We, for the time being, Evelyn, we have very much focused on getting the buy-in. You know, it is, as you can imagine, there's always a lot of flashlight and fireworks in Brussels when a strategy is adopted. But you need to go to every corner of Europe to increase the knowledge about adaptation it as such, but also the strategic framework. So this is exactly what we are doing. We now do a lot of talking in the similar setting, talking to cities, different communities, businesses, member states. By next week, well, it's actually this week, the 10th of June, we will have conclusions by the Council. So it's one of the legislators where member states will, give their statement and their, evaluation of the strategy. And I can already, break the news that it is overall very positive. There is, of course, different emphasis put on certain issues. Nature-based solutions come very strongly out, but as such also acknowledgement of vulnerabilities, necessity to work on social equity. The term of just resilience is also picking up. For the international setting, we prepare a sort of communique so that also at the climate change conference in November, everybody, understands that Europe is not anymore just about cutting emissions and forcing the others to do likewise, but that we empathize and we realize that as the neighbors are vulnerable, we are too, and we are building all the knowledge, all the policy, all the partnerships we need to do so, and we are happy to be partners with the other countries. In terms of very practical, let's say, tools that cities could be interested, we work on the so-called policy support facility under the Covenant of Mayors, because we do realize that there is still missing knowledge as to where to start with these huge challenge of climate risks and climate hazards out there in the open, where cities have already to plan for the future or for now. This facility should help in designing the adaptation plans and really start the process. So it's one of the, let's say, concrete port of calls that cities may use in the future. We also launched the Health and Climate Observatory that is now hosted on Climate Adapt, where you can also see, what is happening. And I know there are some countries, typically the Netherlands or Germany, that have dedicated a lot of attention to this, interrelationship between climate and health. And it's not just about emissions; it's actually also about moving diseases. And in the, let's say, in the fall, we really hope to start, the process on identifying the vulnerable regions that should benefit from the research funding for climate risk assessment, for a demonstration of a solution. But we also count on some level of preparedness of regions. This is not, it's not possible that, Brussels does it for the regions. There must be at least a sort of human, or resources back office in the regions with whom we would be able to work in the future. And it's in the really in the benefit of regions. And I believe that at least in this setting, in the Baltic setting, in the past, I had always the impression that that was present, that the willingness and the right level of resourcing of knowledgeable people and the skill set that you would need for climate adaptation challenge.